Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to this talk. This is joint work with Federico. It's about screening p-hackers. And so, in the past 15 years, academics have become increasingly concerned with the harms of p-hacking. And by p-hacking, I mean researcher degrees of freedom that lead to statistical significance. In the realm of observational studies, which are sort of common in economics and other social sciences, p-hacking can take the form of someone attempting multiple covariates or multiple econometric specifications, and then selectively reporting the most significant one. Right? And there are reasons to believe that today's technology expands the scope for such potential p-hacking. You see, today we have these large and very wide data sets that contain a very large number of covariates for each observation. So for example, we have these genomic data which contain, for each individual, not only their socioeconomic outcomes, but also their, complete genetic sequence. It contains something like 300 million SNPs. SNPs are different, variations in the genome, and each of these SNPs could be potentially correlated with an outcome like education attainment. Also, nowadays we have access to, very cheap and very powerful computational resources. And access to these fast computers makes it very easy to exhaustively search through a large set of specifications, if you so wish. Now, these kinds of p-hacked results with false statistical significance produced through this kind of procedure may lead to misguided and harmful policies, at least until they're correct in the long run. And so really the question here is, how can we mitigate the harms of such p-hacked results on policymaking in a world that implements policies based on p-values, in a world with technology that's enabling ever easier p-hacking? Okay? And so I will begin by telling you some seemingly unrelated development, which is like, if you work with the US Census data, you might know that the most recent census release, the 2020 census, features what's called the disclosure avoidance system, where noise is intentionally injected into the census data before it is released to the public. And the goal of such noise is to protect confidentiality of the respondents. And it turns out the Census Bureau has been using various kinds of dissemination noise ever since the 20s, including suppressing data tables from small areas, imputing data, swapping data, so on and so forth. And the key observation here that we make in this paper is that even though this kind of noise is intended to protect respondent privacy, that it can be actually repurposed for the additional purpose, for screening out such p-hacked results. The key idea is that the dissemination noise will turn some covariates into quote-unquote baits, which appear correlated with an outcome variable in the noisy data, but not in the original data. So researchers are going to analyze noisy data to propose policies. And then these policy proposals are checked using the original data without the noise. This will screen out p-hackers who fall for these baits and report these policies which only look good in the noisy data because it happened to have been hit by a realization of the noise that makes them look correlated. Of course, there will be a trade-off when you inject noise. In this case, it helps screen out these p-hacked results. But of course, injecting noise also degrades data quality for those honest agents who have a legitimate use of data. And so we're going to be looking at how the steward of a unique data set, think of the US Census Bureau, or think of something like 23andMe with a lot of genetic data, how they might maximize the positive policy impact of the research done on their data using the right amount of dissemination noise. Let me jump right into the model. So imagine for each observation, we have a continuum of binary covariates, XA, indexed by this A in the interval 0, 1. Right? So for example, we might think of this as the, each different A's representing the presence of various SNPs in a person. There are many, many such SNPs, but let me imagine there's a continuum of such SNPs. For each observation, we also record a binary outcome variable Y. Think of this as the presence or the absence of a disease, if you like. This outcome variable is associated with two things. First, there's a true cause, A star. There is some gene that actually causes a disease. So a person has a disease if and only if they have this gene. So y is equal to x a star. And then there's another covariate, which we'll be calling the red herring, which we'll denote as AR. This is another biologically plausible gene which could be causing this disease. If we reason from a purely theoretical perspective, we can't distinguish between A star and AR. Okay? But the data can help us distinguish between these two things. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to take the most stark case where even a small amount of data can help you distinguish between the true cause and the red herring. I'm going to say the red herring covariate is perfectly negatively correlated with the outcome. Okay? Here's how the data is generated. Nature will draw the true cause and draw the red herring, IID, from the uniform distribution. And then nature generates a data set. Okay? This data set has capital N observations. Having fixed the true cause and the red herring, A star and AR, here's what we're going to do. For each observation, we will realize the outcome equally likely to be 0 or 1. And then I'm going to set the value of the true cause to be equal to the outcome. I set the value of the red herring to be 1 minus the outcome. So for this observation, I've now generated the outcome and 2 covariates. I have infinitely many other covariates to generate. So for other covariates, A not equal to either A star or AR, I'm going to make them IID equally likely to be 0 or 1. Okay? So think of this as like a data set containing, for example, the complete genetic information of capital N individuals, as well as whether each of them has this disease. This world has 3 players. There's a principal. Think of that as the US Census Bureau or 23andMe. Right? The principal is someone who can't analyze the data and can't change the publication norms or policymaking norms. They're going to get this original data set with capital N IID observations, and they're going to release that data with some noise. I'll tell you about this adding noise part later. There is an agent who will analyze the disseminated data to propose a policy, a hat. The proposed policy is like saying, oh, well, I think the true cause is a hat. I think that's what's causing the disease. Okay? A third player is a policymaker, and the policymaker here will be purely mechanical. But the policymaker here has this implementation procedure that decides how the proposal is or is not implemented in policy. And here we'll be looking at a very simple procedure where this proposal A hat is implemented if and only if, when I look in the original data set, I see that this A hat covariate is indeed perfectly correlated with the outcome. Someone has this A hat gene if and only if they have the disease. Okay? If that's the case, A hat is implemented. Otherwise, it is not implemented. Okay? Let me tell you about the utilities and the incentives of the players. This agent, this researcher, is either going to be a maven or a hacker. Okay? And there's each fraction of these researchers are going to be hackers. These 2 types differ in terms of domain expertise, in terms of the knowledge they have about what the true cause is. So maven here is someone who is going to use domain expertise, think of this as like biological theory, to narrow down the true cause to this set of 2 things. They will know that it's either A star or AR, that's the true cause, but they don't know which one is which. The hacker is someone who lacks domain knowledge, who has no idea about what the true cause is. Now, these agents care about 2 things. They care about being right, that is, proposing an A hat that's actually the correct true cause. And they care about being implemented, which means their proposal actually be implemented in policy. And these 2 goals are sort of orthogonal to each other. You can be implemented without being correct, and vice versa. So if you propose something that's actually correct, you get W. If you propose something that's implemented, you get 1 minus W. So W here is like the relative weight you put on being right, and that's allowed to differ across agent types. But any W here will work for the hacker, and I'm going to assume W bigger than half of the maven. So the maven cares more about actually being right than being implemented. So notice that this is a model with very powerful p-hackers. Okay? Why very powerful? They've got a continuum of covariates I could search over, and they suffer exactly 0 hacking cost. So somehow, this is like extreme version of what I told you before, the realistic situation where, this is like extreme version of today's very wide data sets. There are literally, infinitely many covariates and very fast computers, and they incur exactly 0 hacking cost. Now, let's talk about the principle. The principle gets a utility of 1 if the correct proposal gets implemented, -1 if the wrong proposal gets implemented, and 0 if the proposal is rejected. What the principle is going to do is the principle is going to release a noisy data set, so y x hat, where each covariate and each observation of the covariate is flipped with probability q. Okay, so these things are binary. I'm going to flip each of these bits with probability q. And this flipping is done independently across observations and independently across covariates. Okay? And so this q, the probability of flipping, is called the noise level, and this is going to be common knowledge. So in the context of this world, what's a bait? A bait is a covariate where in the noisy data set, notice the hat, in the noisy data set, right, this covariate A is exactly equal, exactly perfectly correlated with the outcome. But this is not true in the original data set. That's what a bait is. By how the policymaker will be implementing these policies, if someone proposes a bait, it would not be implemented because you would look in the original data set and say, hey, look, it doesn't match in every observation, so we should not implement this. Now, I'm going to be thinking of the principle as someone who has very limited scope in influencing how the policies are implemented. So I'm going to take as exogenous given the fact that we use this particular procedure for implementing the policies, right? So there's some kind of unmodeled stasis in the publication norm or in the science advocacy process. The principle here will be very powerless to they can't write a contract to elicit the agent's domain expertise, write a contract to reward accuracy, or something like that. They're using the one tool at their disposal, namely the amount of noise injected into the data set before releasing it, and seeing how much we can do with that one tool. This idea of injecting noise might remind you of something that's like holdout data. So you could hold out part of the data set, give the rest of the data to the agents to estimate. Indeed, we may view holdout data as a kind of dissemination noise, where some rows are made fully noisy. Instead of injecting IID noise in each entry, I sort of give you sort of unmodified rows 1 through 100 for estimation, and I completely hold out. I show you absolutely nothing of rows 101 through 200, let's say. Another difference is, in the world of holdout data, you're as a researcher told which rows are being held out, 101 to 200. But here in the world of injecting noise, we're not going to tell you which covariates are baits, right? We're going to somehow secretly plant these baits into the data set. Okay. Now, why do we model noise like this? Well, this model of noise, of sort of injecting IID noise, we think more closely resemble how the US Census Bureau does things in practice, and we think it's more applicable for data sets without a natural symmetry that lets you easily partition things into estimation things and holdout set. Now, let me derive the rational behavior of these two types based upon their utility. It turns out what a hacker will do is the hacker will search through the data set, look for some covariate which exactly matches the outcome in every observation. That, in other words, the hacker finds it optimal to rationally, maximally p-hack. Okay? But of course, there are infinitely many covariates in data set, infinitely many things that even satisfy this condition, but only one is the true cause, which means with probability 1, that which the hacker proposes is a wrong policy. What the Maven will do is Maven knows the A star and AR. The Maven will propose either A star or AR depending on which one matches the outcome in more observations. And it turns out the Maven's proposal will be accepted if and only if they happen to propose the true cause. So let me write Vi of Q as the probability that type I's proposal gets accepted under noise level Q. Okay? What the principle is trying to maximize is following, right? Every time you accept the hacker's proposal, you're definitely doing something wrong, so you don't want to do that. You want to minimize this term. Every time you accept the Maven's proposal, it turns out it's always the correct thing, so you want to maximize that term. The following lemma is what's allowing us to use noise to screen different types. Let's think about the marginal impact of a very small amount of noise, starting from no noise. What's the marginal impact of a small amount of noise on the probability of the proposal being accepted? It turns out a small amount of noise has 0 impact on the Maven's probability of being accepted, but it has a strict amount of impact on the hacker's chance of being affected. And that's what's allowing us to screen 2 times. Why is this true? Well, the idea is if I inject a small amount of noise into a data set, it doesn't really prevent an agent from finding like a policy that would pass the policymaker's test if the agent started with a small set of hypotheses, if they only checked a few things. But if you're someone who p-hacks and you exhaustively search through a large number of candidates, then that is precisely when this small amount of noise gets amplified. In other words, in this world, the p-hacker is being screened out precisely because they p-hack. Nevertheless, by the way their utility is written down, p-hacking is a rational response. That is how they maximize their utility. Okay? As a calibration exercise, suppose I have 100 observations. I flip each bit with 1% probability. What is the probability that some A is a bait if I see that it matches exactly the set of all outcomes? The answer is actually more than 63%. Okay? But what's the probability if I additionally condition on the fact that this A, which happens to match exactly, is one of the 2 things which the Maven theory says is one of the candidates? In other words, I start with a very small set of candidate hypotheses. The answer becomes roughly 0%. That is, if I had a small set of ex-ante hypotheses that I'm checking, as opposed to exhaustive checking everything, then that's when essentially I'm not affected by noise. 1 more minute? OK, perfect. Now, so what's nice about having this sort of quite stark model is that it allows us to solve out in closed form the optimal level of noise, and this expression here. The exact functional form perhaps isn't so interesting. What's more interesting perhaps might be these comparative statics, right? The idea is, the optimal level of noise is increasing in the amount of hackers, or with more hackers, screening out those wrong policies becomes relatively more important. And with more observations, the optimal level of noise decreases. It turns out you can create the same level of noise creates more baits, and so I can keep the same number of baits. I can tune back the level of noise, keep the same number of baits, and still provide better data for the actually honest workers. So let me conclude with the takeaway messages, right? So dissemination noise is this data stewardship tool which is already in use, which can be used to serve this additional purpose of like screening out p-hacking. Right? The idea behind this is that noise creates these baits which attract and screen out uninformed hackers while minimally impacting researchers who have an ex-ante theory. That's the main idea. So thank you very much. Please.
Thanks a lot for the talk. One thing I was wondering, and maybe this is like rubbish, but so in this model that you have, the Mavens are in a very strong position because this true cause is like perfectly matches the data. And in reality, I could imagine that the true cause actually correlates worse with the data than some p-hack things. So there's a disadvantage. And I was wondering whether, have you looked at models like that? Do you have for what you can do then?
I understand exactly what you mean, right? So in a world where sort of, so we're looking at the most stark, literally the most stark version of this model where the true cause is exactly perfectly correlated and the other one's exactly negatively correlated. So one related thing that we did do that's related to this question you asked is we made the other, the red herring covariate, less perfectly negatively correlated. Right? In that case, basically, we're sort of weakening in some sense we're making the Maven weaker, but in that sense, much of the results go through. Now, if this A star is not perfectly correlated, now there may be kind of a problem in the sense of sort of the policymaker might then want to perform a different test. Right? The test that we're looking at in this environment somehow hinges on, that doesn't even make sense, hinges on somehow there is a perfect kind of thing, right? But we think this kind of intuition carries through in different environments. So we did some numerical exercises, for example, in various other kinds of worlds which look quite different than this. Like we have some in the paper, some numerical exercise that look like more look at linear regressions, which is a different world. And you're not going to have a perfect fit with the even a true linear model. And in that world, we get similar results. Yes.
So it's something sort of more abstract about your model that I didn't understand. Apologies if I missed it. But it's seems like you're saying that the data provider already has to understand the kinds of questions that are going to be asked about the data, what biological plausibility of a red herring looks like, what kinds of tests they would need to do. Like, it seems like they almost have to know the thing that is eventually going to be found in their data in order to set up an appropriate red herring. And that seems really, really strong. So am I misunderstanding something?
No, you're not misunderstanding. And so, okay. So one thing is, when I'm injecting noise, I don't need to know what the red herring is. So the person who's doing noise injection, they have no idea what A star is or what AR is. So I think like A star and AR, I think of these as having, realizing later on in time. So this data set is out there in the world, and later on we realize, we want to study this particular problem, and so the person injecting the noise certainly doesn't know like theory. So they don't know what A star is or what AR is.
Did you do simulations and run it with like real parameters, and like how does it work out?
Yeah, we ran some simulations in a different world. I mean, so somehow this kind of model we set up, the binary model is quite stark, but we ran some simulations with like sort of linear regression problems, and then just to look at so there's a true linear. The true linear regression is these three covariates generating the y. I add some noise to these things before I let you see the thing, and there's some numerical exercise in that sense. But they're not, I guess, if you're asking whether we ran numerical simulations of like, I don't know, more real-world data, we have not yet done that. So even our linear regression exercise is like synthetic data, right? So we pick three things that are generated.